Good morning, future composters. My name is Morgan. I am the general manager at 3,000 Acres, and I'm so excited today to be talking about backyard compost solutions. This is thanks to International Composting Awareness Week and Darebin City Council, who have asked us to do a workshop on composting today, and then one on worm farms and Bokashi on Saturday. So thank you to those of you who are joining us. But before we kick off, I just wanted to take a second to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that I'm filming on today, and that's the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respect to elders past, present, and emerging. And particularly as a food grower, that's something that I think is so important because we often don't acknowledge the long agricultural history of this land long before colonization. And if that's something that you're interested in, I can't recommend highly enough the book by Bruce Pascoe, Dark Emu. I found it a really great introduction and quite revolutionary in my understanding of agriculture and this landscape. So today we're talking about backyard compost solutions. As I said, it's International Composting Awareness Week, which is a week that looks to give people the solutions to be able to do some composting right where they are, as well as teach people about the significance of composting as an environmental contribution. So as I make this video, please do ask any questions that you have, problems that you've had with your compost. If you're considering starting up a compost and you're not sure where to start, I'm going to be talking through the basics, but I would love to address all of your questions directly. As you can see, I'm coming to you live from the garden, so I have tried to position myself as far away from any of the 4 beehives that we have here on the property. And my worst fear is that I'll get stung by a bee right in the middle of doing a post. So fingers crossed we don't have any disasters, and instead I can just use this as an opportunity to show you the compost system that we have here on the property. So as I said, today we're talking specifically about compost, but on Saturday we're talking about worm farming and Bokashi, which are 2 other composting solutions that tend to work better for those of you who might have a smaller space. So make sure to tune in for those ones if, for example, you live in an apartment or in a small courtyard. But before we kick off, I did just want to address really quickly, what is composting? What are we actually talking about? So essentially, I want you to close your eyes for a second and imagine a forest floor. And there's leaves falling to the ground, there's animals dying, there's animals going to the bathroom, and there's all of these organic products, that is, things that used to be alive, that over time are rotting down on the forest floor. By mixing together, those materials decompose and create new soil that plants can grow in. So anything that used to be alive does decompose in that way and produces something new, a resource that nature can use to continue growing. So when we compost in our home setting, what we're doing is taking that process from nature of not producing any waste, but creating a new resource out of decomposition, and we're speeding it up. We're making it go really fast. Because as home gardeners, or just people trying to do the right thing, of course we want to create a resource out of that waste, and it also gives us something beautiful to grow new food or flowers out of. So that is the essence of composting. And the reason that people have gotten so into composting in recent times is, for a lot of people, because they saw war on waste, but more generally that people are becoming aware of the environmental implications of not composting, of our food going to landfill. So because we're doing this video for Darebin City Council, I wanted to give you some statistics as an example of that. So of all of Darebin's curbside waste, that is when the bins get put out and picked up to go to landfill, 38% of that is food waste. And that's pretty standard across Australia in terms of this huge amount of food waste that gets transported long distances and it then breaks down anaerobically in a landfill. So what I mean by that is because it's mixed in with plastics, with metals, it doesn't have access to air, it breaks down in a way that produces greenhouse gases. On top of that, the transport to the landfill contributes to a lot of greenhouse gases. So if everyone in Darebin were to recycle their food waste correctly, that would save 6,000 tons of waste from landfill, and it would contribute to 7,000 tons of CO2 being saved from the atmosphere. So you get the sense that the implications are huge if people are able to compost in their own properties or near their own homes. The environmental benefits are really massive. So the first thing that we want to do in contributing to that is reduce our food waste in the first place. So currently, if you pick up 5 grocery bags from the grocery store, on average, in the average Australian home, 1 of those goes straight in the bin. That is that 1 of those out of 5 grocery bags gets wasted. So the first thing we can do is be really comprehensive in making sure we make lists and that we utilize all of the food that we're purchasing and bringing into our home. So for me, that's things like learning how to keep food correctly. It was only in the last year that I had my mind blown that tomatoes shouldn't go in the fridge when you get them home. and that there's a whole science behind what fruits you keep together so that they continue ripening, and which need to be kept separately so that they stay fresh for longer. Darebin actually produces a fact sheet on this, which I found really helpful. We have it hanging up on my fridge at home. And it basically outlines how you should store different food. If it needs to be in a dark place, if it should go in the fridge. And you'll find that food keeps much fresher for longer. You waste less money at the grocery store, and you end up not having lots of sprouting and rotting fruit and veg that you've spent your good money on. So the first thing is trying to make sure that we are not buying too much food and storing it correctly. But I think the next thing is learning to use the whole plant when we are cooking. My pet peeve, the thing that drives me nuts, is when I see people purchase beetroots at the grocery store, take it home, chop off the leaves, and chuck them straight in the bin. Ugh! Of course the bottom of the beetroot is delicious, that's what you want it for, the root, but so are the leaves. The leaves taste just like silver beet, it's a very close relation, and they are absolutely worth cooking up. Now, when I run this workshop in person, I often find people go, oh gosh, all this time I've been wasting beetroot leaves. And it's true, there are a lot of plants where much more of the plant is edible than you first realize. So definitely do your research. There's a few cafes that are specializing now in cooking from root to tip, as well as a helpful book that I've gotten from the library before called Root to Bloom, which helps you kind of have a look at how you can use the rest of the plant. For those of you just joining us, don't forget, ask all of your composting questions as we go. I am going to address them all. Of course, I'm going to be talking about tips and tricks, but I'd much rather address the problems you're having in your compost. So, in addition to using the whole plant, I do recommend signing up for Darebin's Sustainability e-news. They post a lot of really great tips about cooking seasonally, using the whole plant, workshops you can go to that teach you more skills around composting. So, very, very helpful to sign up to that as well. The next thing to think about when you get to your composting system is your hierarchy of waste, and I feel really strongly about this when I bring food into my house. For me, when I bring food in, the first thing I want to do is eat it myself and eat it fresh. Let's say I leave it a little bit too long, it's not fresh anymore, so the next tier down is, can I freeze it? Can I make it a smoothie or a stock or something else where a less fresh version of that fruit or veg is still okay? If it's gone beyond that stage and I'm not able to eat it myself, the next stage is poultry. So in the past, I've had backyard quails, I've had backyard chooks, and they of course are producing resources for me through using my food waste. So if I have something that is just a little bit too wobbly for me, but still totally edible, chooks are gonna be very, very happy to receive that and turn that into delicious eggs and manure. If it's gone beyond the stage of the chooks, good thing we have a worm farm or compost system that can handle that waste. Because in your hierarchy of waste, dealing with it on site in your own space is way better than shipping it off site so that it can be dealt with by somebody else. But let's say that you don't have your own compost or worm farm system. The next thing I would be thinking about is a site like Share Waste. So for example, at my house, I can compost for more than just my household. So I let local people who live in apartments come to my house with their waste and I compost it for them. And I get linked in with them through Share Waste. It's a great site to find locals in your area who can either take waste or give waste. So make sure that you look into that one. The last step in my hierarchy of waste, long before we get to landfill, is a FOGO program, or effectively a program where your council is able to take waste from your house and dispose of it in a composting system. So Darebin does have this, where you can put food waste into your green waste bin and put it out for your fortnightly collection. And that's really, really helpful, because as we go through this, I'm going to recommend a bunch of stuff that you don't put in your compost system. So for example, meat and animal products, no good in the compost system, fine for Darebin's FOGO system. So if you have waste that's left over that's not good for composting, keep that in mind as well. So the next thing I wanted to talk about are, what are the different solutions for composting? What are the different systems that you can set up? And so for that, I want to go for a little walk, because the most basic system that I see the most in Australian backyards is the typical black or green bin that usually sits down the back of the garden and doesn't really get noticed all too much, but is very, very common. So let me flip you around here. So this is your pretty typical compost system. This one, it was actually pulled out of hard rubbish. I'm a bit of a tip rat, and I find hard rubbish is just a gold mine for rejected compost systems and worm farms that people haven't been able to make work in their own space. And you can see something that I've got going on with this system is that it's in a pretty shady location. It doesn't need to be in direct sunlight. And there is a nice fork that's sitting next to it which is making sure that it gets stirred on a really regular basis. And we'll talk a little bit about why that is so significant. So this is the most basic of composting systems, is a bin like this, which over time gets filled up, and then you're able to either pick it up or stir out the finished compost product on the other side. This and open bays are probably the most common, but some other systems that I see quite frequently are, for example, compost turners. So that's where this kind of rounded part is elevated off the ground, and there's a lever that people are able to turn in order to flip the compost over. I find those are really helpful if you're someone who has a bad back and you have a little bit of trouble getting into your compost and turning it over. The same go for compost aerators. So that's where there is basically a chamber into the compost, which is trying to make sure that it gets good access to air. Of course, worm farming, Bokashi, are other systems of composting, of speeding up the decomposition process. But we're going to talk about those on Saturdays, or on this next Saturday, so make sure you tune in for that one. So with all of those different composting systems, any of them can work. It really just depends on the space that you have and the limits you have. So for example, if you're someone who is really unhappy to have rats in your system, you might choose an elevated compost system, like a turning one. The last compost system, and this is one I get asked about quite a lot at the moment, it must have been on Gardening Australia or something similar, is trench composting. That's where you dig holes or a big long trench in your garden, and you throw your food waste inside of there, cover it back up, and walk away. That system absolutely works. It's basically just putting your decomposing material into the soil directly and letting it break down over time. So my caveat on that is that it breaks down a little bit slower than in a traditional composting system, and it requires you have a bit of space. I don't know how much food waste your household produces each week, but for me, we would run out of space for banana peels pretty quickly in my household. So that's why I prefer these kind of traditional systems. So I would love to hear in the comments, what composting system do you have? Are you totally fresh and you don't have one, or are you using one of the ones I listed off before? If you have something different, I'd love to hear about that as well. In terms of where you put this compost system, I said before, it can kind of go wherever. Ideally, it's not like directly in the sun, because what I generally find with these kind of home composting systems is that they're not a traditional hot compost. A lot of the time they're a glorified worm farm. That is, that it's full of worms that are actually helping with that decomposition process, and they don't want to get too hot. That said, unlike a traditional worm farm system, which is a tiered system that needs to be totally out of the sunlight because the worms will cook, these are pretty flexible in terms of where you can leave them in the garden, so don't worry about that too much. Where you can get some of these different compost systems that I've just listed, I mentioned before that I've picked mine up out of hard rubbish, and I do that constantly when I see them by the side of the road. Normally they have a small flaw that can be corrected, great. But if you're looking to buy one new, of course you can get one from your local nursery center. And depending on the council you live in, for example, if you live in Darebin, who's sponsoring this video, then you're able to get them through an online website called Compost Revolution. Compost Revolution have Bokashi systems, worm farm systems, composting systems, and you get a discount by putting in your address, and the council has subsidized the cost of that composting system. Because of course they'd love to see you put less into landfill and instead compost it at your own property. So check out Compost Revolution and see if you're able to get a discount there. Now let's talk a little bit about how to compost, and thank you for those of you posting your questions. That's great. I am going to address them in just one second. But let's talk basics, how to compost. So there are 4 main ingredients that are going into your compost, and then that's all you have to do. The first is green materials. That is materials rich in nitrogen, and we'll talk about what they are in a second. Second is brown materials, carbon-rich materials. And the last 2 ingredients are super simple, air and water. That's pretty straightforward to get into your system. So what we're talking about with those 4 ingredients is basically mixing a bunch of things together that's going to create a reaction in your compost that's going to heat up and make sure that that compost cooks and decomposes at a fast rate. So when we talk about green materials, that's all the stuff that you're trying to get rid of. That is the scraps out of your kitchen, let's say some peels from root veggies, some banana peels, some leftovers that you didn't quite get to in time. It doesn't matter if they've already gone a bit moldy. So all of that food waste, and to some extent your garden waste as well. When we talk about brown materials, they tend to be a little bit harder to get at a home composting scale. But effectively that's things that used to be alive but are now very dry. Think dry leaves, think paper that's been shredded up, shredded cardboard. all of those are great examples of brown materials that you can use. Now, one of the problems I often find is that home composters have a little bit of trouble getting a hold of those brown materials, so I've got some tips and tricks for that in a second. But what you're looking to do is get the green materials from your kitchen scraps, your brown materials, and put them in equal quantities into your compost. You then want to make sure it's got enough water in the system, and that just looks like that it's staying moist. So what I do in my own compost is sometimes I find that the green materials I'm putting in are moist enough. Other times I add a little bit of water. Whenever I put in brown materials, I just put the watering can in there for a second and make sure that it stays nice and moist inside the system. The last ingredient there was air. And so, of course, when we're talking about air into the compost, it's not just on that top layer, but getting the air right down into there. So that's what I'm talking about with a turning compost, or using a shovel or a fork to just shovel up that compost, fluff it up so that the air can travel down through the system and make sure that everything is decomposing with access to air. So a lot of people ask me, how often do I need to turn it? That seems like a lot of work. Honestly, I'm going to give you an A+ if you're turning it every week. I think that's very impressive. I count myself as doing pretty well if I'm turning it once a fortnight. So don't beat yourself up about it. Nothing's going to go wrong if you leave it for a little bit. I'm a very chilled out composter and I still have great success. So just good if every time you remember, you get a little fork in there and you turn it over. So as I said, we have those 4 ingredients that we're trying to get into the compost, and ideally you get them in the right quantities so your compost really gets cooking. And what we're talking about there is hot composting, where all of the chemical microbial interactions that are happening there are creating heat, it's generating energy, and you'll find that your compost breaks down really fast. I'm talking about in a matter of months. But if your compost never gets that hot, if you don't get the quite right materials, that's okay too. It will still decompose over just a longer period of time. So generally, if you're using one of these larger bins, you'll find that your compost could be ready in anywhere from 3 months, if you're doing really well, to 2 years if you throw it in and you never touch it. So generally, I find that my compost is about ready to use every 6 to 9 months in my own household. And that works really well for me because my worm farm takes care of all of my stuff I want to go really fast. So I hope that's making sense in terms of the general way that you compost your 4 key materials: brown, green, water, air. But if this is all sounding really, really overwhelming, my recommendation from here is just choose the right system for your household, whether that's what we're talking about today with composting, or maybe worm farming Bokashi like we talk about on Saturday, and give it a go. It doesn't matter if it goes wrong. There's nothing that's going to go really, really horrendously wrong. Worst case scenario, you might see a rat, but I guarantee the rat was there before you got the compost. We do live in urban Melbourne after all, and they are everywhere. So there's nothing that can go wrong with just giving it a go. And if it is seeming really overwhelming, still check out Share Waste and see if someone on there is able to take waste for you. Now, I'm getting a bunch of questions, so I want to do some troubleshooting about compost and see the issues that people are having. So thank you so much for Nicola for your question. Can you use paper that has been drawn on or printed for brown waste? Great question. So before I mentioned that brown waste is kind of hard to come by for people living in an urban setting. So the common examples that I see people do have are things like shredded newspaper, an egg carton if you get your eggs in cartons, being able to rip those up. Are really, really common examples, or other ripped up kind of cardboard, dry leaves from your garden. But absolutely you can throw in some other bits of paper. My only recommendation is keep it in moderation. I once saw a school kitchen garden that had used so much A4 printer paper and had so much bleach in it that it had actually damaged their system. It had killed all of the soil beasties that need to be doing the work for you. So don't use paper that's been really heavily printed like magazines, and don't use way too much bleached paper, but a little bit is totally fine. I have a big attitude of everything in moderation. So absolutely, it's fine if your paper's been drawn on, and it's fine if it's something like newspaper and it has a little bit of that ink in there. For those of you who are struggling to get enough brown waste, I recommend maybe checking in with a local cafe. Can you rip up their cardboard and their newspapers? I make my partner bring home newspapers from his work every day, and that works really well to contribute to our compost system. So a question from Steele: can you put the solid waste from a Bokashi bin in a compost bin, and does it take a long time to break down? Great question. So effectively what we're talking about with that is a Bokashi bin, which is basically like a mini little compost that's using some microbial interactions to speed up the process. And it produces both a liquid and a bit of a fermented sludge down the bottom that people are often asking what they can do with. Now, the official word from Bokashi is bury it in the ground. Then make sure you don't plant there for a few weeks and it will break down. It will continue to decompose in the soil. That absolutely works. So if you don't have somewhere to bury it yourself, you can hit up a friend or someone with a garden and they'll take it. But there is also a great deal of debate about whether or not you can put it into a compost system. I say yes from chilled out Morgan composting school, and I absolutely put Bokashi from local apartment residents into my compost system. It just stays a bit fresh for a few weeks, so I wouldn't put that compost directly onto my plants, but it does continue breaking down inside the system, so that's totally fine. So a question here from Gayatri, thank you so much. Can citrus peels be added in compost bin? Great question. So this is another one where people often say, oh, what can I not put in my compost bin? My firm and fast rule is don't put animal products in there and don't put too much of bread or rice or any kind of like really weedy products like burritos, things like that. And there's a range of reasons for that. Some of that has to do with rats, some of that has to do with human health stuff and whether you might be overwhelming your compost system with a particular material. But don't freak out about it. Don't worry if a little bit gets in there. With citrus, a reason people are talking about this is that it's not worms' favorite food. So often people will say, no, you can't put citrus, you can't put onion in worm farms. I'll tell you on Saturday, I'm pretty chilled out about that. My worms do get some citrus, just not in great quantities. In the compost bin, it will break down, absolutely. It can just be one of the slower things to break down. And citrus is a really tricky one because it's one that chooks won't touch, they're not interested. As I said, the worms will leave it till last. It's not their favorite buffet item, but it can absolutely go in the compost. If you're someone who is juicing oranges on the daily and putting in your peels, you might find that they take a while to break down, but so are avocado pips. Totally fine, put it in there. My attitude is give everything a go. So a couple other questions on here, and some comments as well. Thank you so much. So, Kat, thank you for your question. I use Bokashi and it gets moldy and smelly like vomit when I open it. Do you have any tips for successful Bokashiing? That doesn't sound good at all, Kat. So for those of you who haven't heard of Bokashi before, as I said before, it's like an accelerated process where we're basically using something that looks like sawdust, sprinkling it into the system and letting it ferment. It shouldn't smell like vomit. It should smell like fermenting, and that's why you're able to have it inside your house. So for example, I brew kombucha inside my house, and then Bokashi smells quite similar to that when it's going well. That sounds to me like the process has gone wrong and needs to be started again, which is something you do every few weeks anyway. So what I'd really recommend for you, Kat, is tune in on Saturday when we're talking specifically about Bokashi, but also on Compost Revolution's website. They have a free tutorial that you can do, and that kind of steps you through, here are things that could be making it a little bit smelly. So I'll post that in the comments after we get done filming. Thanks for the question. So please do keep them coming. So Orlando has asked, thank you Orlando, do you need to add soil to the new compost bin? Great question. The answer is no. So you can set it down directly on top of the soil, and what you are producing in your compost system is soil, but you don't need to add soil for it to happen. So what's going on in there is those materials are breaking down and producing a really nutrient-rich soil, but they don't need an additive of soil in order for that to happen. So don't worry about that. Common misconception. I also get it when people look inside my worm farms and they think, oh, you've given the worms bedding of soil. Nope. They've produced that themselves, so no need to add that in. So another question here from Kat. I put animal products in my Bokashi bin and eventually put the Bokashi stuff into the compost bin. Should I not do that because it has animal products? Another great question, Kat. No, that's totally fine. So as I said, with a traditional composting system, I recommend you don't put meat and animal products in there. But with a Bokashi system, you can put whatever you want in. It'll melt down everything. It is such a fast composting system. And that's totally fine by the time that it gets into your garden beds, whether that's in the soil or into the compost. So don't stress about that. Yes, you can use Bokashi for animal products. Gayatri has asked, which worm farm do you recommend? Ooh, great question. I'm a fan of free worm farms, as I said before. I do love a tip rat system. But that said, I have some Compost Revolution worm farms that have done very well for me. The two things I find go wrong with worm farms are that the tap breaks off or one of the legs break off, and I haven't found that to be the case with their systems. Worm lovers who are based here in Victoria actually have a beautiful large-scale worm farm system that I see work really successfully in community gardens as well. So either of those I think are really good systems, but if you're looking for something cheaper, you can build your own worm farm quite successfully. So I've seen them done a lot of times with bathtubs that people have found by the side of the road, or for example, I've seen at Reese Plumbing, they sell bathtubs that have a chip in them for $10. That can make a great worm farm if you're looking for a little winter DIY project. So lots of solutions. Of every worm farm I've ever had, which is of 3 different brands that I've picked up in Hard Rubbish, all of them have lasted the last 3 years at least. So I don't think that so long as you care for the system and don't move it around a lot, that you'll have a problem with any particular brand. So another question from Orlando, thank you. What do I do with all of my compost? I just have a native garden. Great question. So for a lot of people who are living with small spaces, and that's true of lots of people in Darebin and across urban Melbourne, you might not have a space for what you're producing in your worm farm or your compost or anything else. So there's a few solutions I recommend for you. One is you could start a veggie patch if you have a little bit of room, and with the right mixture you can use some of that compost even in a potted situation, so long as you make a nice potting mix out of it. But other than that, what I would recommend is either checking out on Share Waste and making it available, or my top tip would be to join your local Good Karma network. That's a Facebook group where people are able to post things exclusively for free. There's no buying or selling, but you're able to just say, hey, I have some spare compost, would anybody like it? I do this all the time, looking for soil and looking for different materials, and people will get in touch right away and say, yes, please, I will be over in a second with some big bags, and they'll collect it from you. So check out your local Good Karma network. If you're having trouble getting rid of some of your compost or your worm castings or worm tea, or even if you're having trouble on Share Waste, finding someone who's able to take your waste, that can be a good way to connect with people. So these have all been really, really great questions. Do keep them coming, because what I'll do is, other than speaking on this video, I'll be checking in over the week and answering any questions that you have, any problems you have with your compost system. So don't worry if you're not watching this video live. I'm still happy to answer those questions just typed out for you. But I wanted to also mention a few other questions that I get asked quite frequently. So, for example, a really, really common one is people say, nothing's happening in my compost. I've established it, I'm putting the materials in, but it just seems to be sitting there. That to me could be a few things, but it probably sounds like you're putting in too many brown materials and not enough green materials, so it's not getting cooking, or that you need to give the compost a stir. So start there, give it a big stir, add a little bit of water so there's good moisture in there, and then see if it does start to cook. If not, keep adding green materials and see if that kicks it off. You can, of course, chuck in some additional materials that are seen as compost activators. So for example, some people say that coffee is a compost activator. Some people say certain plants, like comfrey, is a compost activator. Give it a go. I'm big on anything citizen science that you can experiment with. Kat's asked, what's that balance of green and brown materials again? You'll hear different advice from different people. I say 50-50 and you're good. So sometimes I've seen 60-40, or I've even seen 70-30, but I say 50 green, 50 brown, and go for it. Keeping in mind that some things don't fall neatly into the green or brown category. For example, a leaf when it is alive and moist and wet when it's come out of your garden, that's a green material. When it's dried out all the way, it's a brown material. So a leaf that's halfway along that process might be a little bit green and a little bit brown. That's all right. Great question from Tracy. What about the cardboard core of toilet rolls? As far as I know, that's fine. I don't know if it has a small amount of plastic in it. I don't think so, depending on where you get your toilet paper from. I've seen some commercial ones that feel a bit plasticky to me, so not on board, but absolutely if it feels like cardboard. A caveat to that is do be really careful that nothing is too plasticky when you're putting it in, or sometimes, for example, takeaway containers will say that they're compostable. I've given it a red hot crack with a lot of them, and I have my doubts. Some of them, the caveat on that is that they actually need to be exposed to very hot composting and UV in order to break down. So check yourself before you put a whole lot of those materials in there. I find they take a long time to break down. The same goes for stuff like cotton, for example, a t-shirt that's been all ripped up. You can put it in there, but you're going to be waiting for a long time for it to break down. So it depends your tolerance level. Kat has asked, I put my cat's used recycled paper pellet kitty litter in the compost. Is that problematic? I would answer yes, Kat, for a few reasons. One is that your cat's probably a carnivore. In fact, your cat is definitely a carnivore in some way. It would be consuming some meat. And so that can be problematic in terms of the waste going into the compost for some health reasons. But another reason that I don't like animal waste inside of compost, worm farms, anything else, is that, for example, you deworm your cat and you deworm your dog, and I don't want you to deworm your soil. So I recommend not doing animal waste in that way. There are solutions for dog waste that I know of where you're able to use certain microbes that break it down, but I would recommend you keep it out of your standard compost if you can. Anne's tuned in and let me know that there's no sound, so please do comment if you're having trouble hearing as well, just so that I know that that's a problem. But I am going to wrap up here in a second because I'm conscious that I've been talking for a very long time. So the last thing I wanted to address was a problem people often complain about with their compost, which is that it is a stinky, wet mess. Your compost should not smell that bad. Should it smell a little bit like decomposition? Yeah, of course. So don't stress if that's the smell that you're getting. But if it just looks like a stinky, wet mess and it's not really doing anything, that sounds to me like you have too much green material and not enough brown material. So make sure you get that mix right and then give it a good stir. Okay, so I'm gonna turn you around here so we can finish with a calming shot of one of my beehives, and I'll come down here. But I just wanted to finish by saying thanks to Darebin City Council and thanks to all of you who have asked your questions. Keep them coming. I will type my answers in the week ahead. But also make sure that don't get too stressed out about it. The main thing is that you give it a go, and it's okay if things go wrong. 100% compost, I like to think, while there is some science to it when you first learn it, it's actually more art than science, and you've just got to feel your way through it and see what mixtures go really well in your garden system. So thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you're enjoying these bees that are apparently just getting warm and deciding today is the day to go and find some nectar and pollen as we go into the cooler weather. Again, tune in on Saturday when we talk about worm farming in Bokashi, and thanks so much. Bye for now.